friends, emeritus faculty, the Dean of the College of Science, Professor Craig Moritz. We've got also the family of Professor Chris Bryant, so welcome. We're very happy to see you here. So I'm Joan Leach. I'm the director of the Australian National Centre for the Public Awareness of Science here at the ANU, affectionately known as CPAS. I'm also chair of the ANU Academic Board. Now, I want to begin this afternoon by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. The Ngunnawal Ngambri people, pay our respects to their elders, past and present. So this afternoon we have an extraordinary opportunity. We get to pause and celebrate the extraordinary life and legacy of Professor Chris Bryant. The past few years, I need to tell all of you, have been very, very difficult. We remain masked, making distance from one another, and the last few years have been marked by all sorts of loss. However, I think it is fitting that we do not lose another thing, and that's losing sight of celebrating the extraordinary contributions of colleagues, and to express our gratitude and even joy at their many accomplishments. And this is especially true of Professor Chris Bryant. He leaves us an extraordinary legacy. He was a researcher in parasitology and biochemistry, a leader in the biological sciences here at the ANU. He led his own productive research groups, and also he led the whimsically named BAMBI. He was Dean of ANU Science, ANU Council member, past president of the Australian Parasitological Association, and many, many more roles with many accolades to match. He and Mike Gore, who sadly passed at the beginning of this year, founded CPAS, my academic home, and had a vision not just for their own science, but for making science available to all. And we'll hear from Emeritus Professor Sue Stocklemayer, aptly recruited by Chris to lead CPAS later on in our program. I'm also very aware that Chris was not just an academic leader, but also a dear friend and colleague. Mentor to many academics, including to me. I'll not forget our last conversation. He phoned me as the pandemic hit the university, exactly at the moment where I needed a bit of a pat on the arm. Things weren't very easy here at the university, and we were suffering a bit. He told me, June, CPAS will survive as long as you keep your research standards high, your teaching standards higher, and you keep your wits about you. It was great advice, and it was delivered at precisely the right moment. We'll have an opportunity to all share stories about Chris. I know there are many later this afternoon. So the order of our gathering today is that I'm now going to introduce in a moment the Dean of the College of Science, who will offer his acknowledgement of Chris's legacy and introduce our speaker for the day, a fellow parasitologist, very thoughtful, also science communicator. Emeritus Professor Sue Stocklemayer will give a vote of thanks, and also her remembrances of Chris as a dear colleague and friend. We'll then have the opportunity to spend some informal time together, remembering Chris and perhaps sharing a toast or two in the foyer. There's also a book in the foyer outside that you can sign and share some of your remembrances and stories of Chris. So, let me introduce Professor Kieran Kirk, Dean of the College of Science. I know he is known to many of you here, but I will remind you of his many excellences. Kieran carried out his PhD in the Department of Biochemistry at the University of Sydney. In 1989, he went on to Oxford University in the Laboratory of Physiology, where he held an Oxford Nuffield Medical Fellowship, the Staines Medical Research Fellowship, and a Lister Institute Senior Research Fellowship. He returned to Australia in 1996 to the illustrious and whimsically named BAMBI to succeed Chris, and I think we'll hear a bit more about that. From 2009, he took up the position of director of the newly created ANU Research School of Biology, now held by my colleague, Professor Craig Moritz. And from 2014 to 2017, he was dean of the ANU College of Medicine, Biology, and Environment, and since then he has been dean of the ANU College of Science. Kieran, I give the over to you.
Thank you very much indeed for your very kind introduction and your words words about Chris and others. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the lands of the Inaugural and Ngambri people, and I'd like to acknowledge and pay our respects to elders past and present. Welcome in particular to members of Chris's family, to Anne, to Tim and Caroline, their children, and to Pat and Lily, who I think are here as well, grandchildren. Chris Bryant was part of this university for almost 60 years. And Chris left multiple legacies at the university, and through these he had a major impact well beyond the university, nationally and internationally. He came together with Anne in 1963 to join the zoology department. It had been established in the Faculty of Science a few years earlier, in 1959, by Desmond Smythe. And Desmond was a parasitologist, and he gathered together in that initial zoology department a number of parasitologists, and Chris was one of them. Chris's particular interest was in the biochemistry of parasitic cestodes, trematodes, and nematodes. And Chris was a real pioneer in this field. There were papers in Nature on metabolism of these important organisms. And to my mind, Chris was really the first of the Australian biochemical parasitologists. He was the first genuine biochemical parasitologist in the country and had a major impact in that regard. Australia has long had a substantial reputation in parasitology. There's a lot of parasitology research in Australia. And there's a number of different strains to that, a number of different threads you can see. There's a large component around the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute, and that was very immunological in flavour. Very early on in the 1970s, Gus Nossel, as director with Graham Mitchell, declared the intention to develop a vaccine against malaria. So there was a real strength out of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. But no less strong was the strength out of the ANU, focused not so much on the immunology, but on the biology of the parasites, on understanding the biochemistry of the parasite at a profound level, and then using that understanding to develop therapies against particular parasites that were important and in many senses neglected. And that's very much a theme that continues today. That's one of the real strengths of this research school of biology. Biochemical parasitology, using an understanding of the biochemistry of parasites to contribute to the development of new therapies. And so that's a particular legacy you can trace back to Chris and back to that early zoology department, and it's a real strength here at the ANU today. Chris was also a pioneer, as well as the fundamental biochemistry. He was a pioneer in what we talk a lot about today, in translating fundamental research into real-world impact, what today we call engagement and impact. And Chris was a real pioneer in this area. Together with some of the people in this audience, he worked on developing a particular treatment for parasitic worm infections. It led to a patent. It led to a subsequent commercialisation of a series of new sheep drenches, which generated substantial royalties for this university. And that dates right back to the 80s, and those continued through the 90s. So that's something, again, a legacy, something we aspire to do today, and which Chris did par excellence decades ago. He was an early and influential member of the Australian Society for Parasitology, which today is a highly functioning society. It's very active, it has a regular program of meetings, it supports the careers of early and mid-career researchers very strongly, and Chris was at the very forefront of this. He was one of the early council members in the mid-60s, setting up the bedrock for what is today a highly influential society, and Chris played a key role there. And here at the ANU, he rose up through the ranks. He became a full professor. He became head of the zoology department. It's wonderful to see some of the former members of that department here in the audience today. And then he went on to become dean of the then Faculty of Science. And it was in his role as dean of the Faculty of Science that, first of all, he started the program that then gave rise to the Australian Centre for the Public Awareness of Science. So it started off as an academic program and developed from there, and Chris played a key role from his position as dean. And Sue's going to talk a lot more about this towards the end, at the end of the talk, in terms of how that then went on and developed. And as dean, Chris also oversaw the reorganisation of the 3 biology departments that were in the then Faculty of Science. At that point, there was a biochemistry department, a zoology department, and a botany department. These were reconfigured from 3 departments into 2. One was called Bambi, as Joan pointed out, the other was called Bozo. And for Chris then, a little bit reluctantly, then after stepping down as dean, became the inaugural head of Bambi. And indeed, it was how I first met Chris, because I came a little bit later to take on the role as head of Bambi. And it was in that context that I first met Chris. He stepped down as head of Bambi in 1994, and and then he formally retired from the university, and that unleashed a whole new burst of energy. And it was in his role as an emeritus professor that he really then did a lot of work and laid the groundwork with Sue and others for what is now the Centre for Public Awareness of Science. And so much of that work, much of that activity came from when Chris was an emeritus professor, and Sue's going to talk about that. So Chris's legacy has been huge. He was a founder of biochemical parasitology in this country and had impact well beyond this country. He was a visionary in the area of science communication, and Sue's going to talk about that. He was a leader within the university who had a major impact within the university, and you can still see some of the resonances of that today. And so it's very fitting that we honour Chris in this way with an inaugural lecture, and there is no better person than to deliver that inaugural lecture than Professor Alex Maier, who is Professor in the Research School of Biology, who is, like Chris, a parasitologist, who has, like Chris had, a passion for science communication. So Alex's passion for parasitology was ignited when he was an undergraduate student, first at Tulane University. He then went to Southern Colorado in the US. He did his PhD at the University of Heidelberg, and there he was working on trypanosomes, which are the causative agents of African sleeping sickness. And then in 2000, Alex came from Germany to Australia. He was awarded a postdoctoral fellowship to join the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute in Melbourne. And here he was the head of the Malaria Functional Genomics Facility, and he was in this role from 2002 to 2008. And this was the very early days when we were learning how to manipulate the genes of the malaria parasite. It was fiendishly difficult, and Alex was a real pioneer in this field. How do you change the expression of genes? How do you turn them on and off as an experimentalist in the malaria parasite, and thereby learn more about the fundamental biology of the parasite? So he led this major research initiative at Weihai for 6 years. From Weihai he went to La Trobe University, and then very fortunately for us, in 2012 Alex came to the ANU to take up position here in the Research School of Biology, and that's where he's based today. Alex is an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow. He's a Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. He's a Fellow of the Australian Society for Parasitology. He's been the driving force in very many initiatives here at the ANU. To name just two, he has pioneered an international training centre between the ANU and Humboldt University. And through that training centre, many tens of students, PhD students, have graduated with degrees from both Humboldt and the ANU, and have spent time both at Humboldt and at the ANU, and that was Alex's vision. Another initiative that he took on behalf of the Parasitology Society, the Concepts in Parasitology course, is a course for 16 early career researchers from all around Australia. It runs once each year. It brings in parasitologists from around Australia to teach the students, to interact with them, to teach them basic biochemical parasitology skills. Last year, Alex received the ANU Vice Chancellor's Award for Education Excellence, so a testament to both his teaching and his research. As I said, there's no one better to deliver this inaugural Chris Bryant lecture. Alex, with great pleasure.
So thank you very much, Kieran, and thank you everyone for being here to honor Chris's legacy. My talk is entitled Sushi, Sex and Mind Control, and why parasites still matters today. Now I will explain that rather cryptic title as we go along, but I feel deeply honored to talk about parasites here at this occasion to honor Chris's legacy. And when Joan approached me when I wanted to do it, I immediately said, yes, I don't skip an opportunity to talk parasites. But as time went on, I got petrified because I thought, how on earth can I actually live up to this role model? And so, even on the context that sadly I had very few interactions with Chris last time when we organized the 50 years anniversary conference for the Australian Society for Parasitology. So I will focus on the parasites here, not on Chris. However, I start with Chris here, This is a photo from 1977. And you might actually recognize two more people which are in this room today. No? No? Well, there's Carol and Eva Brenner. So, thank you for being here. And it also, I think it speaks for Chris's legacy that at this, for such a long time, he saw the vision, the potential in people, and became mentor for people. And of course, Eva became the CEO of the Australian Pesticide and Veterinary Medicine Authority. And Carol is a successful researcher here, and she became the first female president of the Australian Society for Parasitology. Okay, now we switch to parasites. And mostly people think about parasites. When they think parasites, they think about diseases. And this is true because billions of people on this planet suffer from parasitic diseases. And it's not only the well-known malaria parasite, and of course ANU is very strong in that regard. Australia is very strong in that regard, and it's the most important parasitic disease in terms of death that are caused. But there are many other parasitic diseases that are equally important and more important in terms of cases. So you see Ascariasis this year, 1.2 billion people suffer from that. Hookworm infection, filarial diseases. So the list goes on, and therefore, of course, talking about parasite is very important. Over the last century, we have made enormous progress in fighting those diseases. And as an example here, I will outline the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2015, where this team of 3 researchers were recognized for their drug discoveries to fight disease. And this was Bill Campbell and Satoshi Omura for the discovery of ivermectin that is used to fight filarial disease, elephantiasis, given in liver plantus, onchocerciasis here. And of course, 2-UU for the discovery of artemisinin, which is our last resort drug against malaria nowadays. So, having made those progresses, why are parasites still a problem? Well, in a sense, we came, progress we made, we actually came victim of our own success, because those drugs that were developed, they were ideal drugs, they were cheap, they were easily distributed in the field, and so people misused them in a sense. So they were widely distributed, people took them without having the right diagnosis, and therefore drug resistance actually occurred. And moreover, we relied on those drugs as the sole savior against those parasites. So, talking about malaria, for example, we have drug resistance in the field against every single anti-parasitic, anti-malarial drug we have rolled out into the field. But there's more to it. We are more people. Yeah? There are more people means more transmission potential for those parasites, but it also means that those people actually move into areas which were inhabitable before because maybe of parasitic diseases. But the pressure of having those many people around pushes those people in those areas, and therefore there is more parasites in those populations. More mobility. We all are aware of the mobility that happened with COVID. I mean, mutation starts and within weeks it's spread around the globe. It's not that the COVID virus actually distributes, it's us. It's us sitting on a plane distributing those diseases around the globe. And then, of course, in terms of parasitic diseases, where there are very often also vectors involved, there's also the mobility of the goods, and those goods are sometimes contaminated. Snails or mosquitoes are attached to those goods, and therefore parasitic diseases actually spread. So from what I was saying, you could imagine that, yes, you understand that parasites are important, but it's also something, malaria, elephantiasis, it's something that is far away. Well, I have news for you. Parasites are closer to home than you might think. Yeah? And on this slide, I don't have any numbers for you. It's all anecdotal evidence, but for me, this anecdotal evidence is almost more important than the pure numbers. For those people who have children at school, just think how often you get a notification about a head lice, and you know how big the problem is. What I also find extremely interesting is the social concept of it, because it's always the other person's problem. It's never your own kids. And so I have heard this quote, my kids have the lies of your children. So there's also social aspects about parasites. Pinworms. Yeah, we don't talk about pinworms because they're in the never region of the body. And so it's not polite dinner conversation to talk about pinworms. However, if you go to Woolies and you see what products are on offer, you might get an inkling what kind of problems there are out there. Scabies. In the scientific literature, you encounter it as a problem of remote communities. It's a huge problem, but we push it away. Well, O'Connor Pharmacy stocks 3 different products. I'm sure it's not the travelers from the remote communities that actually use those products. Backpackers, well, maybe backpackers. So there are really a lot of bed bugs in those shared accommodations, and that becomes a major issue. Not only in Australia, Gold Coast, Cairns, all those hotspots there, but also New York and other travel destinations around the globe. And then something that might actually be present here in this room are actually face masks. I would say 95% of us are the hosts of those lovely mites. And those lovely mites normally live in our skin. They live in the sebaceous glands and in the hair follicles of our face and where our eyebrows are. And normally they are, yeah, you scratch, yeah. I admit to it, this is a photo of my mite. And those mites actually crawl out during the night, they have sex, and then they go back. And one thing I would like to explore is what they're actually doing underneath our face masks. So parasites are closer to home than you might think. But of course there are also the big events, the 1998 Sydney water crisis, where the whole of Sydney was asked to boil the water. What happened? Well, the water supply was contaminated with 2 really fascinating parasites, Cryptosporidium and Giardia. You can see this is actually an intestine, and all those parasites actually blocking the absorption of the nutrients. Therefore, the nutrients go in other parts of your digestive system. Inside the digestive system, all of a sudden, a different bacterial colonies grow up, and very often they produce gas. I leave it there. And of course, Cryptosporidium is also, those are villi in the digestive tract, and what you see here in red are the parasites. It's not only humans that suffer from parasites, it's also our companion animals. And there's a whole field out there how we share the parasites with the animals we live with. I would like to outline the commercial value here. So, according to official sources, the cost of dogs and cats are $3,200 per dog and $2,100 per dog for the respective owners. And they are quite prevalent. So 5 million dogs are here in Australia, 3.8 million pet cats, but interestingly also 2.8 million feral and stray cats. So if you think about what those cats actually do to our native wildlife, there are almost as many out there in the wild than we have in our living rooms. But back to the costs here. If we assume that only a third of those costs go towards healthcare in terms of prevention, going to the vet, and so on and so forth, then it's an almost $10 billion market just for those two companion animals. It's enormous, just in Australia. Okay, but there are not only lots of animals, lots of companion animals, there are also lots of people, as I already said. And when I looked this graph up, I was actually quite shocked it hit home that during my lifetime, the population of this world grew from 4 billion to next year 8 billion people. So we doubled the amount of people living on this planet. And you might think, well, 4 or 8, big thing, big deal. Just imagine you live in a family of 4 with your income, with your infrastructure, with everything that provides nicely for this family of 4, and then next year you are a family of 8. That's the kind of constraints we are facing. And of course, one of the major things is how to feed those people. And so I would like to spend a little time to talk about food security in terms of parasites. So, animal food productions rely on parasite control. The global animal health market last year was almost $40 billion US, and with 10% annual growth. If I would get that annual growth on our savings, I would be very, very happy. Almost 2/3 of those animal health products are parasiticides, anti-infectives, and vaccines, meaning they all potentially target parasites. In high-intensity farming, in a lot of cases, it's only possible through the use of drugs. This is true in terms of poultry farming. If you have a farm that has more than 10 or 20 chicken, you actually have to treat, otherwise you lose your flock. And fish farms. So high intensity. And we need those high intensity farming environments in order to feed the increased population, human population. And internal parasites, so I'm not talking about ticks, lice, and so on and so forth, which also cause significant damage. Internal parasites like protozoa and worms cost Australian livestock industry $500 million per year. That's while they are treating for parasites. Yeah. So you can see what the average farmer actually is exposed to, what they are struggling with. the marine environment is the new frontier. And this is exemplified by this graph over here. It's a little bit dated. I couldn't find anything that is more up to date, but it gives you the flavor. So we have those 4 categories: cattle, pigs, poultry, and fish, and shellfish. So, and you can see that between 2008 and 2011, there was almost no growth in terms of cattle. There was some growth in pigs and poultry, but the big difference here was actually not overall. So that's in line with what we see here for pigs and poultry in terms of tons of protein that were produced. It was actually the increase of aquaculture. And this is important in terms of parasites. First of all, the parasites in the marine environment we almost have no idea what's out there. There are very intensive and very good research groups looking into it, but just the vast array of different parasites that are out there in the marine environment, it's just we are scraping only the surface. But it's also those kind of environments in the aquaculture. If you have a stable or if you have a farm, you can somehow kind of segregate it away from the environment. Here, no way. There are little fish coming in, there are little fish bringing their parasites, and all of a sudden, because you have this monoculture, you have enormous outbreak in your fish. Why is fish also important? It's here the feed conversion ratio here. So the amount of food you actually feed to an animal and what you get out in terms of a product. Yeah? So this is very low for cattle, but it's very high for fish. And therefore, this is also the new frontier in order to feed the growing population. We were talking about alternative food sources, growing insect larvae, growing insects in order to provide more protein to people. Yes, good idea, terrific, great. But, of course, those insects also harbor parasites. And parasites that at the moment are free parasites, you only see them occasionally in people. If we use more of those food sources, then of course those parasites become more prevalent. Climate change. I come back to malaria here, and the first point of this map is to illustrate that what we regard as a tropical disease is not a tropical disease historically. So this is the distribution of malaria until the 1900s, and 53% of the world's land surface was endemic for malaria. And only in the last 100 years we were able to actually push those areas back. And so the areas are now shown in red and in purple. The other point I would like to make is, of course, Australia. Australia is malaria-free. It was declared malaria-free by the WHO in the early 80s. But historically, the north of Australia was a malaria endemic area. And we are surrounded by malaria endemic countries, so it is not a big leap for mosquito, for infected mosquito, to jump over to the landmass of Australia, and that happens by the way all the time. However, we have sparse population up there, and we have a good health system that actually quenches those sporadic outbreaks. However, with global warming, we might actually see a shift in the distribution of vectors. More the mosquitoes that are capable of transmitting certain diseases can move further south, and therefore more people are living together with those vectors. But in terms of malaria, it's not only the vector, it's the distribution of the vector, it's also how fast the vector actually develops. So this is temperature dependent. If there's an increase in temperature, the mosquitoes develop faster. They bite more often, therefore increasing the potential of transmitting a disease like malaria. And of course the parasite also develops faster. So we are creating, by just turning up the temperature a little bit, this perfect storm of increasing the potential for transmission. And so for malaria, the minimum is 70 degrees, the maximum is 34 degrees because there's an upper limit, and the optimum is 25 degrees. Okay, biosecurity, big thing in Australia, and of course this is also driven by parasites. And I don't have to remind you, at the moment, Varroa finally arrived at our shores, and it also makes me aware how industrialized our agriculture sector is. Yeah? We are not relying on normal pollination. We are actually shipping those hives around in order to produce those high-value crops, high-value products like the almonds here in Victoria. Australia is the world's third biggest producer of almonds. And this is only possible because this is industrialized. So, Varroa, how does it actually look like? Well, here we have a bee. This bee is infected by 2 of those mites. And the mites, unfortunately, both affect adult bees in their brood. We see here, those are the hairs of honeybee, and this Varroa mite sitting on top of that honeybee. If you are interested in this kind of concept, what bees, how important bees are for our ecosystem, I can recommend this book here, The History of Bees. Don't judge a book by its cover. It's not about the history of bees, it's actually a novel. Yeah? It's something, but it really drives this notion of the importance of bees. Okay, biodiversity. Well, we actually murder 10,000 species every year. This is just mind-boggling if you think of the millions of years of evolution that are lost. And of course there has always been lost species, but because of human action, this has actually accelerated by 1,000 to 10,000 times than it would normally be. Now, this is sad enough in the case of the dodo here. What people normally forget is that the dodo had parasites. And very often those parasites are very, very specific to this particular species. And then here in terms of the parasites of the dodo, it was not only one parasite, but those feather lice here, they actually have different areas of the dodo when they're specialized. So the dodo is the world for the parasite, and so there were some specialized for the wings, for the feather on the breast, then feather on the neck, and on the back of the dodo. And with the extinction of the dodo, those parasites also disappear. This is something not a lot of people think about, and in this paper here, I would like to quote, models suggest that co-extinction, so the extinction of other species that depend on the species that actually has been eliminated, may be the most common form of biodiversity loss. Paradoxically, few historical or contemporary co-extinction events have actually been reported, not even in the scientific Okay, that brings me to conversation bias. Are we really so shallow that we prefer and we go all warm and fuzzy-hearted because of this beautiful animal? Yes, I like it too. But please, regard the humble parasites. Yeah? So they are equally important, and we are actually eroding our safety net, the resilience of this community of animals and plants. We are putting larger and larger holes into this safety net. Evolution. Something, of course, Chris was very interested in his later years, and I can highly recommend this book, where he actually came together with Valerie Brown, came from a different angle and actually saw evolution as something as working together, where people and animals, where societies, organisms actually work together and evolve together, which is extremely important. Of course, I'm biased, and the people in the room who know more about evolution than I do might disagree, but for me, sex is also a parasite avoidance strategy. So, what do I mean by it? Well, if there's no sex, the prodigy, the next generation actually is an identical clone of the original one. So this is shown here in those donuts. So one brown organism produces other brown organisms here. And of course, parasites being nifty, they specialize on those brown organisms. And if the genetic makeup is identical, it's easy for a parasite to exploit. And then once they get hold in this population, every single organism, every individual in that population actually has the parasite. And of course, you can do that with another population, blue population here, and the blue population also has specific parasites. But now, if we bring in sex and we have the recombination of the genes, then instead of having just brown and blue, we actually have a mixture of this, and it's hard for those parasites. The parasites can still infect individuals in this makeup, but not the whole population. So there's this old saying from 1973, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And I was very, very pleased that someone took that one step further, given the fact that 50% of organisms probably have a parasitic lifestyle, and therefore evolution, the study of parasites is actually the study of life. Someone came up with this: nothing in evolution makes sense except in the light of parasitism. And evolution of complex replication strategies, and I paraphrase here, parasites, while traditionally seen as a threat to replicator systems, are instead the means by which this complexity, this diversity actually evolves. Okay, being a parasite is very, very convenient because you get free food, free shelter, and free transportation. Heaven, paradise. Well, it comes with a little footnote. Very often you have to find a new host. Yeah. And that's actually where the parasites have evolved enormously creative solutions to this problem. So here for the lancet liver fluke, as the name implies, it lives in the liver of the cow here. The eggs are shed with the feces of the cow. Not very nice. The snail actually eats those eggs. The parasite develops in the snail, and then another form of the parasite is excreted via the mucus, via the slime of the snail, and it becomes available in the environment. because the slime, the mucus is a little bit sweet, it's eaten by an ant, the parasite develops further in the ant, and then the ant gets eaten by a cow. Yeah, makes sense. What doesn't make sense?
Cows don't eat ants.
Don't eat ants, yeah. Ant eaters eat ants. What's going on here? Well, the parasite actually manipulates those ants. Infected ants, instead of going back to their nest in the evening and spending the night in the nest, they become teenagers. They spend the night outside, and instead of hiding, they're actually crawling up the grass. The temperature drops. They get actually a cramp in their mandibles, and they actually hold on to that piece of grass, and they can't leave anymore. In the morning, the cow comes along, eats the grass, eats the ant, and therefore the parasite is happy. It's even better than that. Inside of the ant, there's a distribution of labor amongst those parasites. Most of the parasites develop here in the abdomen of the ant. One parasite takes a hit for the team, moves up near the brain, and actually manipulates the end of doing this abnormal behavior. How cool is that? It's amazing. Another example here, pocketbook muscle. Hey, look at this little fish. Yeah? A predatory fish comes along, eats the little fish. Surprise, it wasn't a fish. It was actually a mussel. It was the mantle of this mussel. Tricking the fish and coming closer. The moment the fish snaps this piece of flesh, the mussel releases little developmental larvae. They latch onto the gills of the fish. They suck blood for a while. They get a free ride, and eventually they drop off and develop those mussels. Yep. Parasites in action. Okay, I skipped this here. I want to also end on a note that parasites actually providing solutions. Beautiful Christmas Island. It is an ecosystem like no other. It is the Galapagos of the Indian Ocean. Despite phosphate mining, despite detention centers. What do we have here? It's also very known for their red crabs, because they're everywhere. You step, they move out of the way, you step, they're really everywhere. They're in your hotel room, they roll into your car, they're everywhere. Beautiful. Now, they also have an important ecosystem function. They actually feed on the leaf litter. They remove all the leaf litter from the floor. Now, there is also the yellow crazy ant, which was not on Christmas Island before humans arrived. And approximately 100 years ago, those yellow crazy ants were introduced, and they actually feed on those crabs. They spit formic acid into their eyes, onto their flesh, and the crab actually dies, and they use it as a source of protein. Now, for a while, there was a cohabitation there. They were kind of a problem, but not really. And then, beginning of the 90s, the yellow crazy ants really became a problem. Why did they become a problem? Well, this is, for example, an example here. So those are crazy ants. This is not dirt or anything. You can take a shovel and you can take them away. And they all of a sudden formed super colonies. The biggest super colony that was observed on Christmas Island was 720 25 hectares. Yeah. So many ants. Now, why did they all of a sudden form those super colonies? Well, we humans introduced another animal here, the scale. And the ant is a terrific farmer. They actually farm those scales. The scales produce sugary substance. And they go crazy, like our kids. They go crazy on that sugar, and they form those colonies, they propagate, and hence 40 million red crabs are now on Christmas Island, and that's down from over 80 million 30 years ago. This is just to exemplify what actually happens when such a super colony actually takes hold. So this is how uninfested piece of land looks like. You can see all the leaves are removed, and then finally this vegetation comes in, which is not a bad thing, but it actually leads to all the nutrients are in plants rather than in the earth. Now, where do the parasites come in here? Well, this is this humble parasite. Can you see it? It's very, very small. It's a micro wasp. And this is a cane toad story, but a successful one. It was actually introduced on Christmas Island because this micro parasite actually affects those scales. They lay their eggs in those little scales, and therefore those super colonies cannot form. All right, I skipped that one too. At the end, I just want to explain my title. So the Sushi actually stands for the impact on the people, for the application of the knowledge. The sex, of course, sells, hence in the title, but it also stands for the big picture and the fundamental science behind it. In the mind control, for the fascination, for the primeval fear we have of parasites, and the need to be picked apart. And I think Chris actually realized that. He saw parasites as the complex creatures they are, and he tried to understand them. And he saw them as the yin and yang, not as antagonistic opposites, but as complementary parts of the same thing, where it becomes a bigger thing because it works together. I had the privilege over the last few weeks to explore Chris's contribution. And what really struck me was that he seemed to traverse the different layers seamlessly, with ease. He covered split between molecular and organismic biology, between fundamental and applied research, between the peers in the general audience, and between the private and the public persona. His writing style is deeply personal. He was a great storyteller, entertaining, authoritative, but without putting himself on the pedestal, but by sharing the fascination and curiosity. His writing is enormously fun. There's lots of humor, and you can almost see the letters sparkle. It's the twinkle in his eyes that comes through the writing, but it's still accurate and scientific. And he always led by example. He led here at AU, and that's his legacy. Then not only RSB, there are lots of people working on parasites. There are people over at John Curtin, at the Center for Advanced Microscopy. We have CSIRO across the road. We have people in public health. We have FENA, chemistry and physics, where there are collaborations, and all those people are infected with parasites. And of course, there's CPAS with Joan and Anna-Sophie. Anna-Sophie, she comes from the circus background, something Chris was deeply passionate about. And we had coffee and we talked about parasites, and of course the obvious thing was the flea circus. And so we explored the flea circus a little bit. Our new project is comics and parasites, so I'm very much looking forward to it. There's also the teaching legacy, so we have 2 core courses, but you cannot escape parasites if you study biology at ANU. There are other courses having parasites as a model system. Kieran already talked about our international graduate program and contribution of all those people to the National Science Week. It is spearheaded for a long time now by Christina. And if you are interested, please come to the Woden Shopping Center on the 13th of August to see parasites in action. And then finally, the Australian Society for Parasitology. Kieran said, outlined Chris's contribution to the society. But it's more than just being there, it's the legacy also. And the society has 3 pillars. It's the scientific communication through the journals. IJP, the original journal, now became 3 different journals, and Kevin is the editor-in-chief of one of those journals. But Kevin is also more than that, because he's following Chris's footsteps, because Chris brought the International Congress for the World Federation of Parasitologists in 1986 to Australia. And Kevin sets out to bring it back 40 years later to Sydney. Outreach. The society is very, very important in outreach. And Elisa Jones, who's the secretary and executive officer of the society, she's actually a graduate of the CEPAS Science Circus. And finally, mentorship and training. And here, former student of Chris, Nick Smith, has to be congratulated, because he follows really Chris's footsteps. He's a great mentor for everyone. He actually runs the society despite all the presidents that come in and out, because he's the man behind it and he doesn't take the credit for it. Thank you, Nick. Okay, finally, Chris, scientist, mentor and communicator extraordinaire, and of course, he was bitten by parasites. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I'm going to now introduce Professor Sue Stocklemayer, who will give the vote of thanks as we seamlessly move between microphones. So, to remind you, in 1996, apparently Professor Chris Bryant decided to retire. But in fact, this was only another chapter. As he and others started to set up CPAS and the education programs that we were offering, he realized that it needed full-time intellectual leadership. Dr. Sue Stocklemayer was appointed as the first lecturer in science communication in Australia. And it's pretty close to being the first anywhere. You should document this. She and Chris immediately set about establishing CPAS and bringing it from strength to strength. Sue grew up in Zambia, graduated in physics and chemistry from the University of London, worked in the Zambian copper mines as a chemist, immigrated to Australia with her family in 1982, and returned to postgraduate study. In 1994, she completed her doctorate and was awarded Curtin University's Graduate Medal. She was awarded an AM in 2004 for Science Communication Initiatives and AO for Science Communication and Science Education in 2016. Sue thinks that science communication is the best possible mixture, I agree, combining science, theater, her lifelong interests, multicultural and gender issues, and just about anything else. As emeritus professor, Sue continues to edit the Journal of Science Education Part B, focused on science communication and engagement. She advises students, she provides mentorship, She provides a collegial ear, well do I know, and academic leadership. Sue, I invite you to give the vote of thanks. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Alex. I think Chris would have loved your lecture, not just because of his passion for evolution and, of course, parasites, but because he was never so happy as when he was telling you what awful things live on your body and on your face, especially over lunch. I've been asked to say a few words about Chris and CPAS, the centre which was the result of his initiative. Chris introduced a graduate diploma in science communication in the early 1990s, the first such qualification in the world. Chris had retired as Dean of Science, but wanted to steer this highly risky ship into a remarkable future. The results are all around us here in this room, as graduates of first the grad dip, then the master's, and finally the PhD, all owe their subsequent careers to his vision. Chris was, as we know, a prolific published author in both parasitology and science communication. For example, he organized the world's first textbook, Science Communication in Theory and Practice, which was a joint CPAS effort. Published in 2001, it has also been translated into Japanese, which was also through Chris's initiative. But to reflect more about Chris, as our beloved founder, I would like to focus on his very last publication concerning a small bear called Rupert. Chris's monograph on the subject of Rupert and friends was published shortly before his death, and it is on the internet at the Rupert Bear site. Chris says that the Rupert books were a powerful influence on his life, including his choice of career, and I think it is instructive to examine why this was so. For those who have never met Rupert, he was a bear in boy's clothes who encountered both humans and animals in his adventurous life. He appeared regularly in a beautifully drawn comic strip in the Daily Express. Rupert was an iconic figure for children from the 1930s to the 1950s and beyond. And for Chris, growing up through the years of the Second World War, the stories were an escape and a delight. As a child, Chris believed that Nutwood, the place where Rupert lived, was just over the horizon from his own home on the edge of English fields and streams. And for Chris, the stories were more than just imaginative fiction. Amongst the many characters created by Rupert's author Alfred Bestall was a collector, whom Chris, aged just 10, identified with two real people. These were Hans Sloane, whose collection of antiquities formed the foundation of the British Museum's collection, and Charles Darwin. It was a life-changing discovery. As a result, little Chris read everything he could about the real Sloane and the real Darwin, and he says became fascinated by paleontology, archaeology, and biology, a fascination that remained all his life. Author Alfred Bestall was also a cricket tragic, about which I make no further comment. An important character was the professor, who lived with his dwarf assistant, Bodkin, in a perfect Norman stone keep, and produced a string of inventions that often formed the basis of a terrifying Rupert adventure. Chris says that he hankered after being like the professor, but could never aspire to being Rupert. There is no doubt that Chris achieved his eminent professorship with the rest of us as assistant Bodkins, but let us look a little more closely at Rupert. Chris describes him as a superhero, possessed of skills, initiative, and courage, often acting as guinea pig to test a new invention for the professor. Unlike modern superheroes, says Chris, the bear's early life was quite conventional. Possession of a mother and father who belonged to the English middle class suggested he arrived in this world as a normal mammalian birth without alien interference. Yet he became a hero for generations of children. Nutwood itself could be almost anywhere in the south of England, except it has doors into other universes and other times, perhaps even to Australia. Rupert is an excellent communicator. He has singular linguistic skills, talking with 40 other animals and with humans he meets along the way. Chris set great store by correct English, and many a student can testify to his insistence on good grammar and the creative use of words. I'm often reminded of a memorable anecdote he would recount during our workshops to encourage concise use of language. It concerned a fish shop with a sign on the pavement saying, "Fresh fish sold here today." The English professor, passing this sign, remarked on its verbosity. Sold was surely irrelevant since it was a shop. The sign would be better as "Fresh fish here today." But hey, who would sell old fish? Remove the fresh to remove fish here today. Well, of course it's today, not yesterday or tomorrow, so we have fish here, but it's obviously a fish shop, and here or elsewhere, so cut out the sign altogether and leave it to the customers to decide to stop. Chris had a great sense of humour and told many stories against himself. Not the least was an early experience of media attention, in which he was discussing the parasitic barber's pole worm in sheep. The worm is about 2 centimetres long. Chris supplied a photo which was aired on TV, but he had apparently forgotten to include a size indicator. The worm filled the screen with the caption, "Giant worm threatens Australian sheep." The department back at ANU did not let him forget this photo. Rupert Bear is very brave and is also exceptionally kind. I think this was one of Chris's most endearing attributes. He was an exceptionally kind man. Kind to students, kind to staff, but never compromising on principles of good scholarship. He was also always keen to help others up the ladder. I recall my first day in my new job, over from Perth and feeling my way in the small demountable that was our first science communications centre. A letter needed to be written to the Deputy Vice-Chancellor. I can't now recall what about. And Chris insisted that I sign it, even though the matter was not trivial. I demurred, but he said, and I shall never forget this, "It is most important that people get to know who you are and what you are doing." This was a revelation to me in the competitive world of academia. Rupert Bear was also, according to Chris, a suicidal risk-taker. Risk-taking was never more evident than when we decided we should indeed have a centre. I had suggested this at my interview for my new job in 1996, but Chris, wise in the ways of universities, knew that you can't have a centre without external funding. He intimated to the Chancellery that such funding was highly likely from a sponsor he implied was on board. We shall never know how much he believed it, but the next step was to arrange a launch. A very important person had to be invited. Luckily, such a person existed in the shape of Professor Richard Dawkins. He had recently been elevated to the first Chair of Public Understanding of Science at the University of Oxford. This was an endowed chair with no accompanying department. For Richard, this inaugural appointment meant that he needed personally to expand his new role, particularly internationally. Luckily, Chris would be in England in time to invite him. I got a message. Dawkins will come, but only if he gets an honorary degree. As a recently appointed level B, I had no idea how to do this. Chris suggested one senior academic who might help. It apparently needed 2 essential elements. The person had to have some importance to the ANU and have international stature attested by referees. I wrote to the editor of Nature, to many other eminent persons for references. We decided that the use of the Dawkins textbooks by the ANU biology department was evidence of his importance to the ANU. I had just 6 weeks till council met to get this through. Of course Richard was utterly famous, and the council approved it immediately, unprecedented, so we were told. Then we had to arrange the launch. Chris thought about 80 people would fit in our new premises, which had recently succeeded with Demountable. I tried to limit the invitations and got abusive messages from all over the campus from those who thought they should be there. The invitation list grew and grew. Richard's speech on graduation day included the famous words, "There is no better science than Western science. If there were, Western science would have found it." And at the launch, "Science isn't meant to be fun." The ceremony was, to say the least, a fashionable crush with more than 120 people there, but his presence ensured the guests included the Vice-Chancellor, the Deputy Vice-Chancellors, and amazingly, the Chancellor himself. So when the funding for the centre never happened, it was too late. We were on the map, even though we had no budget. A footnote to this story of risk and possibly even bluff is that Richard inquired of Chris what he should do with his honorary gown. "Of course you keep that," said Chris grandly. We got the bill from the graduation office and were too embarrassed to ask for the robes back. So Richard has that gown, one would hope, in a private place. CPAS quickly grew in student and staff numbers to be the thriving and celebrated centre that you see today. Early seeds sown by Chris have sprouted and flourished, including recent UNESCO recognition. The Science Circus, dear to his heart, now has over 500 graduates. Chris's contribution to the university is immeasurable. His contributions to science and science communication were recognised by a fellowship of the Australian Society of Parasitology and by the nation with the award of the AM. Chris was a pioneer in every way, with generations of staff and students who were the beneficiaries of his wise and generous guidance. We at CPAS owe him so much. He was a great communicator and a brave and insightful risk taker, truly a superhero in the best Nutwood tradition, a man for his time with an endearing legacy. It now just remains for me to ask you to join in thanking Alex once again for a most fitting tribute to Chris and a great memorial.